Good day. My name is Karim Chichakly from IC Systems and also Worcester Polytechnic Institute. And I'm going to talk today about systems thinking for public policy. And I'm going to look at a case study that I've been working on in Brazil for some years. Brazil is kind of in a strange situation. They have one of the highest tax burdens in the world that supports a very large number of social programs. They have lots of social programs. But ranked in the world, they are second to last in the services that they provide because the quality isn't very high. There are lots of problems. They're spending a lot of money, but they're not getting the results that they hope to get. And part of that is because there's no connection between the programs they're doing and the results that they're trying to get. In 2016, I was approached to try to teach system dynamics to some mid and upper level civil servants in the federal government of Brazil. Sounds like a great idea. Maybe if they did some modeling, things would work out better. They wanted to involve ministers, deputy ministers, people at the top level if they could. I had to ask myself if this is the most effective tool at this level. Are these people seriously going to become modelers? A lot of people will be modelers, but if we think about the entire world, there are really going to be a small percentage of modelers relative to people who use models. So I decided that a systems thinking course would make a lot more sense. And when I say systems thinking, I mean like the fifth discipline and what Peter Senge was pushing a long time ago. So I've been working with the top level of the Brazilian government for the past 4 years, teaching systems thinking, looking at problems that they have, and trying to come up with some insights that help them develop better solutions. Started with a highly interactive workshop that had lots of exercises, lots of activities. 110 people registered for the first workshop and 87 attended. These numbers this was the highest, but the numbers were typically, for these sessions, were 50 to 60 people each time. Here's an example of doing an interactive exercise of living loops where everybody has a polarity symbol on themselves, and I start something off and everybody has to react. So my hand is polarity. Watch it follow across, going up and down. Down more and more. Look at that. Okay, everybody see what happened? There was a little exaggeration on the down. Exaggeration as it went down, but it was a very simple exercise so people could understand polarity. Second time, came back and more systems thinking was introduced. There were more archetypes added, and there was a section added on how to engage stakeholders, how to get people involved and actually effect change. They also asked that I include some introductory modeling because their goal was ultimately to do some modeling. So I created some models that were tied to the archetypes. I created some models that were tied to the specific problems they were seeing in Brazil, and we looked at those and we tried to understand those and we tried to figure out how they were built. But this was a huge mistake. There was far too much being introduced too fast. There were only a few people in the audience who were able to jump to the level of modeling at that point. The schedule was extremely rushed. It was supposed to be across several days, but due to holidays and scheduling conflicts, it ended up being compressed into a very short period, just 2 full days. And so this was, systems thinking and archetypes and stakeholder engagement, effecting change and doing it was just too much. And modeling too. It was a mistake to try to fit all that into that little amount of time. So the third time, I was invited to the Tribunal de Contas da União, which is called TCU, and they are like the General Accounting Office in the United States. They are in charge, but they're in the legislative branch, and they're responsible for making sure that money is spent correctly and it's achieving the results that it's supposed to achieve. And they wanted to do it much quicker. So most of the interactive exercises, like the living loops I just showed, were removed, but there were still tons of exercises. It was still a learner-directed process. And directors from TCU came in. That would be the equivalent of a deputy minister. The auditors came in. There were analysts that came. And it was quite successful. So I was invited back again, but this time we figured we'd up the ante a little bit. So not only were members of TCU involved, but key stakeholders were brought in from different problem areas. So they were invited to take this same 2-day systems thinking introduction that we just did. And then we did 4 one-day workshops that were with these stakeholders. And these were in the area of health, education, public safety, and infrastructure development. Instead of trying to cram everything for one problem into one day, right? Wanted to give people time to think between these things. And same thing I would have wanted in a modeling class. I would have wanted to split it up. So instead of doing full day sessions, we did a half a day on one day and a half a day on another day, either morning or afternoon. And then with the stakeholders, we'd build maps that they believed in, that everyone agreed that's how they thought the system worked, and we tried to find points of intervention in those maps, causal loop diagrams. If we look at one of the problems in education, there are huge, and this is not just an educational problem, we'll see, I'll have an example on the next slide, but there's a lot of fragmentation between what's going on at the federal level, what's going on at the state level, and what's going on at the municipal level. A lot of their responsibilities overlap, but there are missed opportunities because they don't work together and they end up not meeting their objectives, which is a problem. In general, the federal government's responsible for infrastructure, which includes buildings, buses, anything like that, whereas the state and the cities are responsible for human resources, hiring people to drive the buses, for example, and materials that are needed. And here's a classic problem that happens a lot in Brazil, or at least at the time it happened. The federal government would go in and, they'd approve the money and they'd buy a bunch of buses for a city. Great. They now have these buses. Unfortunately, the city and the state don't have the money to hire bus drivers or to pay for the gasoline or diesel. And so the buses get delivered, the federal government signs off, we're all done. We don't need to do anything else. But they haven't really achieved their result because the buses are sitting in a parking lot for months and months and months. There are other examples. For example, schools have been built for political reasons, actually in the wrong place, but there's no money. Forget about where it is. There's no money to actually staff the school or to buy the supplies for the school. And so it never even gets occupied. There's just an empty building sitting there. When I did this session, at the time, there were a ton of articles about these urgent care facilities, hundreds of urgent care facilities that the federal government had built around Brazil. However, they weren't equipped and they weren't staffed, so they were sitting empty, completely empty, because there's no local money to do that. A big problem, and you'll see this come up again, is in another problem they wanted to look at, there's no coordination across the different levels. They have no commitment between each other to meet an objective together at the same time and in the same way, in other words, working together. And there are typically not overarching objectives that are tied to direct educational outcomes. The federal objective is met when the buses are delivered. They're done. They're out of it. They've met their objective. We don't need to worry about what the goal was overall. And priorities become inconsistent between the federal government and at the local level. The other problem that Brazil has is even when they do clearly define the objectives, they don't get met, not just because of this split across government levels, but also because it isn't always clear how they get measured and how you figure it out. So they came up with this argument that if there were more cooperation and coordination, this would improve things. So if there's regulation for coordination and there's some control, of course, we're talking into TCU, which is in charge of control, there's going to be more multi-level coordination. I apologize, it's in Portuguese, but the words look very similar to English, by the way. This is multi-level coordination, regulation, control. The more coordination there is across levels, the more consistent priorities will be, the more efficient management will be, and the more efficient control can be. And the more consistent the plan will be with PNE, which is their list of objectives, their educational objectives. More efficient control leads to less corruption, leads to better management, and vice versa. And all of these things improve realizing these objectives, actually meeting these objectives by state. If they don't meet the objectives, there are repercussions, for example, in the media, society, but media was the thing they were most concerned about, and they thought this would encourage priorities to be more consistent. In addition, the more transparency there is, the better control there can be, the more efficient control can be, and the more likely there'll be repercussions for bad things. If the objectives are met, then the quality of education goes up and the repercussions go down. If the objectives aren't met, the sanctions go up, the resources they have go down, and they cannot meet their objectives. So this is a problem. The sanctions they get from a higher level, right? So they were using this as an argument for why we need more cooperation and coordination across the levels. In the health area, they were worried about lack of planning and coordination. There we go, coordination again. The government gives them what they have. They don't give them what they need, and this is a big problem. In fact, they don't really know what the demand is at any time. Things are not coordinated. They don't know. They have a huge hospital system across the government, across the country. They don't, but they actually operate regionally, or even locally, and they don't know the real demand across them. They don't know what capacity they really have or what's available at any time. And you have problems, which you also have in education, by the way, is that the service and the quality from city to city varies tremendously. What this does is it leads people to come into cities from other places because they have better services. So, for example, in Brasilia has good services, but the surrounding communities do not. So people come into Brasilia and they use the facilities there. The problem is Brasilia doesn't get paid for those people. They don't get funded for those services. They only get funded for their local population services. There's also a limit of staffing. It can only be 48% of the budget. So that's a problem. That's set in law. Their reference mode is, here is the quality of service they're seeing today. This is what they'd like it to be. And this is what they're hoping will happen, right? This is what they need. This is what they're hoping will happen. The way it works today, the more collaboration there is, the more financial resources are available. But the more financial resources are available, the less collaboration there is, for political reasons, as we'll see. The more collaboration, the higher the quality of service, the higher power is invested in local politicians, and so the less collaboration. There are legal requirements that have to do with contract bidding, and the more of these there are, the more delays there are to getting maintenance done, and that lowers the quality of service. As the quality of service goes up, though, the health of the population goes up, financial resources available goes up, and human and material resources go up, which increases the quality of service. So this is how it is today, and they drew out how they want it to work and how they want to change it. And you'll notice a stark contrast immediately. The more collaboration, the more financial resources available, the more collaboration. So if we go back, that was a balancing loop they wanted to be reinforcing. This also, the more collaboration, the higher the quality of service, the more collaboration. This was also a balancing loop, and they want that to be reinforcing. The maintenance doesn't change here. The higher the health, the quality of service, the better the health of the population, the more financial resources available. This was also a balancing loop in existing relationships, and they'd like to change that. This is the same. There isn't anything that's changed here. But now we're adding something about policy design and planning. The more collaboration, the better policy design and planning, the more collaboration. And the quality governance and data they have available, right? Remember, they don't know what's going on across these hospitals because they don't have a shared system. Then the better the policy planning and design, and transparency helps both of those. The better the policy design and planning, the higher the budget they're likely to be able to get, which gives them more resources available. Also, the better policy design and planning, the higher quality of service. Finally, they have this goal meeting loop where they need equality of service, and they're actually going to try to get there by planning and design. So if there's a shortfall, they're going to try to make up for it. So this is what they would like the system to be and what they're going to try to move toward. The last example from this group I want to talk about is in public safety. Brazil has a high homicide rate, and we'll talk about this later. I'll have a slide that actually shows the rate over time in another example. And this comes from, these are the reasons they gave. There's violent culture, there's poverty and inequality, there's drug addiction, there's a gang culture, there's prison overcrowding, there's lack of state presence in communities, that means police forces. There's impunity to people who break the laws. There's corruption and a lack of coordination within the police. They gave these reference modes. So here's the homicide rate, and this does have a scale on it. And this is what they want it to do. This is the murder clearance rate, but this is what they want it to do. This is the conviction rate, but this is what they want it to do. And this is recidivism, which is quite high, and this is what they want it to do. That's repeating the crime after you return from prison. They came up with this model. The more gang members and organized crime members there are, the more access to guns, the higher the homicide rate. The higher the homicide rate, the more cases are solved, the higher the prison population, the higher, after a delay, recidivism, and the higher the homicide rate. Very bad reinforcing loop here. If they have nonviolent monitored prisoners, that reduces the prison population. But one thing that's important to realize about Brazil, if you arrest somebody, they go to jail immediately and they stay there. So they're going to be in that prison population for a long time, whether they're eventually freed or not, because they're found innocent. The higher the prison population, the more gang members and organized crime members. So the first insight that they realized just from this little bit of the model is if they don't first improve the prisons and how people end up in prisons and who ends up in prisons, then they shouldn't improve the police capacity to solve crimes, because that's just increasing the prison population. And they shouldn't toughen crime laws, because that will also increase the prison population. They want to break this cycle if they can. And in fact, I can tell you that after this work was done, they in fact did work. They actually did reforms to try to break this cycle. The homicide rate goes up, then more police member deaths happen, more gang members deaths happen. I don't know if you know, they have actually assault rifle, machine gun kind of fights in the streets between the police and the gang members. And the more police and gang revenge there is, and the more homicides there are. The higher the poverty, the more gang members there are. The presence and quality of services from the government decreases that. But if this is low, then inequity goes up, social stability goes down, robberies go up, more cases get solved, and there's a higher prison population, and more people end up in gangs. The more gangs there are, the less presence there is, by the way. And the less presence there is, the higher the poverty is because of robberies and crime, etc. The higher the poverty, the lower the state investment, which reduces the presence and quality of services. The lower the state investment, the lower the police efficiency and capacity to solve crimes. Also, corruption decreases that. And so there are more gang members. The lower this is, the police efficiency to solve crimes, the fewer cases are solved. The more state investment and less corruption, the better efficiency of the judicial system. The more convictions there are, the less impunity there is, and the lower the homicide rate. But if this isn't efficient, if there's lower investment, which is what we just said, then this is lower, the convictions are lower, impunity is higher, homicide rate is higher. Cases solved goes up, convictions go up. If the homicide rate goes up, then state investment goes up as a reaction to that. So the first thing they realized they wanted to do was break this loop. And as I said, they have taken steps and changed policies to try to do that. The second thing they wanted to do is they wanted to weaken this link between poverty and becoming a gang member. And they also wanted to link the presence and gang member link if they could, although they might also want to break this link if they could. Finally, they, of course, want to fix corruption, right? Corruption decreases presence here, efficiency here, and efficiency here. I went back again. I've been there 6 times for these things. I was supposed to go again last spring, but COVID hit. We did the same format as round 4. There were 5 split half days, full day workshops on reduction of bureaucracy, a multi-level governance. Again, they're worried about there not being cooperation across the different levels. So they came up with this coordination, cooperation, communication idea, and something has also been done in this area since we did this. On socioeconomic inclusion, on reducing tax breaks and subsidies because they are mostly arbitrary and they're given to political allies. And they also wanted to improve, this is a process improvement thing, the turnaround of environmental licensing because it was a very slow process. There had been 6 workshops planned, but one of them was canceled because of the World Cup. Brazil was playing 2 half days while I was there, and those were canceled because it's a holiday when the World Cup is going. When Brazil's playing in the World Cup. We'll look at socioeconomic inclusion for this round. There are 50 million citizens who are vulnerable in Brazil. That's about 25% of the population. They're vulnerable in education, sanitation, health, security, and opportunity. I would bet that number's higher than this was 2 years ago, roughly. Yeah. So the goal was to reduce inequality and poverty in 10 to 15 years. And the problem is that the programs they have are not permanently improving people's lives. They're not having an impact. And the way they fail, first of all, you only get support in the family if the children go to school. That sounds like a great idea, but the schools are, as we just saw, subpar because the educational goals are not met. There is no performance requirement for quality of education. That's a big problem. There's a lot of corruption and false reporting, so children often aren't actually in the school. There's no minimum requirement for students' performance either. You get it whether they fail or they pass, and they also get promoted to the next grade, whether they fail or they pass. 90% of the schools meet for only half a day, and that gives the kids an opportunity to join gangs in the other half of the day. Another failure mode is they invest in microcredit and small business support, but these businesses aren't required to register, and they aren't. No one follows up to make sure they're registered and paying their taxes, so that doesn't work. They get pushback from people who are getting the benefits already. They say, you cannot change my income, even though it's something they're giving them. It isn't really, it's money they're getting, but it's not necessarily income. There's a huge problem with skills training. They reach Mostly the lower middle class, they don't reach the poorest people. There are 49 million citizens, again about 25%, in Brazil who are functionally illiterate. They can't read posters that advertise courses for skills training. They can't succeed in a course that requires reading or writing. They can't even fill out applications. For example, if they want microcredit, they can't do it. They can't read or write. Even worse, less than 7% of the target population, these are the 50 million we were talking about, have basic math skills. So the target jobs for the skill training are in retail, construction, and domestic work. Most of them end up in domestic work because, first of all, retail's out if they don't have basic math skills. In construction, that can be, but some people will end up in construction. There's also a resistance to literacy in parents who aren't literate. I didn't need it. I don't need it. Why do you? They don't see the reason to educate the children. Looking at the system structure very quickly, the higher the vulnerable population, well, maybe we should start here. The lower the educational level, the fewer formal opportunities there are, the less formal income there is, and the higher the vulnerable population, which leads to a lower education level because they're in areas that don't have very good education. Family support can reduce the vulnerable population. The labor market can add formal opportunities. The government steps in with cash transfers. For political reasons, the cash transfers may be higher. So low formal income means higher cash transfers, which reduces the vulnerable population. But cash transfers also, the higher the cash transfers, the lower incentive there is for people to get work or to get educated because they don't have to. There's nothing require them to. And then the education level goes down overall. Also, the higher the cash transfers, the more likely they'll engage in an informal income. Now, that's a good thing because it reduces the vulnerable population, but it also reduces their incentive to work or, in particular, to get educated. I mean, they may be working however many hours part-time to do this, but they may not, it's enough to get by, I don't need to work more, and they certainly don't feel like they need to get educated. The more informal income there is, the less formal income there is. The higher the cash transfers, the more children are in school because it requires it. And the idea is the more children in school after delay, the higher the education level is across everything. They're hoping in a generation to raise these people out of poverty, but not all those children are going to school. And again, we already talked about the quality of the schools. The higher the cash transfers after delay, the better health level there is in the population, which means they can actually show up for work and there are more formal opportunities and they can actually show up to school and do what they need to do. Basic public services support their health level and education quality supports education level. Finally, sanitation. The higher the vulnerable population, the lower the sanitation, the lower the health level, and the lower the formal opportunities, etc. Basic public services help there as well. Finally, the higher the vulnerable population, the lower security. As we said, the gangs push security out of the way, and the higher the vulnerable population. Police don't want to go in there. It's dangerous. Increasing public services can help that. So the first thing they wanted to do was they wanted to get rid of this connection between cash transfers and informal income. They wanted to somehow make that formal. They threw around a few ideas, and they wanted to also break this link between cash transfers and an incentive to work or get educated, and that, of course, they can put requirements on. That's a lot easier than this other link. Sixth time I went, which was very end of last year. The goal was to develop policies that would meet the goals they wanted to achieve with those policies and then monitor them over a one-year pilot. So that would have started, those policies were supposed to be developed by February of this year, beginning of February, and then they were going to be monitored for a year from then. I believe the policies were developed. I don't know if anything happened because COVID broke out right after that. And I was supposed to return in the spring to see what was going on and follow up and make sure things were on track. And also to teach modeling, by the way. They want to slowly introduce modeling and just modeling to a group of people who want to model. But obviously, I don't think any of that's happened. And certainly we're not monitoring things over a one-year pilot. This was the same format again as round 4, but this time it was with the Office of the President, Casa Civil, which is the chief of staff office for the president. Everything the president wants to try to do goes through there. And ministry stakeholders. So there were people from all the ministries there. In addition, there was half a day added on stakeholder engagement. It's compression of the stuff that was done earlier. And there was a reduced half-day class specifically for ministers and deputy ministers, so because they didn't have 2 days to sit through a class. There were then 6 one-day workshops, again split half days, on the major initiatives for 2020, which were in the executive branch, which were competitiveness for prosperity, which was looking at gasoline and fuel prices. Transformation of public management and digital services. So that was to try to provide better services, probably through digital transformation, but not necessarily entirely that. Fighting violent crime, that came up again, and we'll look at that. Regional development of the northeast of Brazil, looking at education, again. Fighting corruption, and improving the public policy cycle to have better monitoring and measuring. So we'll look at fighting violent crime. This is the last case we'll look at. It's similar to what we saw before. This is a different group of people with a different perspective and a slightly different objective, but they want to reduce violent crime. Also, the homicide rate is just going up and up and up in Brazil. We already talked about that. It has the highest number of intentional homicides in the world, and it is one of the major obstacles to social and economic development in Brazil. It is a very important thing to try to fix if the country wants to grow its economy and improve its social structure. They have tried giving additional resources to security forces. They have tried increased criminal penalties. As we know, that just increases the prison population, which gives us more gang members and organized crime members. And same thing for increased incarceration rates. They've tried that. So quantity over the quality of them. Efforts to reduce extreme poverty and hunger. This is something that probably can help, and it's very difficult. These are all things trying to treat the symptoms. They aren't looking at the thing holistically. When this group met, and these were people from all areas, these weren't just people in the executive branch. These were there were police here. They were trying to look. There were some military people there. They were trying to look at things across multiple stakeholders. So they came up with this different map than the earlier one. The earlier one led to some improvements in prisons and deciding maybe we shouldn't be trying to incarcerate people for longer and more often. But this ended up coming up with a different set of solutions. So, and of course, it was later, 2 years later. So the more homicides there are, the higher the culture of violence there is. And the higher culture of violence, the more homicides there are. So they thought there was a culture of violence in Brazil, that violence is okay. If you do something wrong to me, it's okay for me to kill you. Like just right away, bang. Like doesn't matter what you did. It's okay for me to kill you. The conflict between gangs feeds both of these, of course. And the conflict gets caused by the more gangs there are, the more conflict there is. The more gangs there are, the higher the drug traffic, which also leads to conflict. I have not put pluses on my arrows here, only on minuses. I didn't say that earlier, but I often will do that to not clutter the diagram. These are all pluses. The higher the drug traffic, the more drug users there are, and vice versa. The more drug users there are, the more homicides there are. Now, they felt that planned urban growth, as opposed to the sprawl they were seeing in many of their cities, would reduce the number of gangs and reduce the culture of violence. In fact, planned urban growth can help develop things like cultural centers. And cultural centers and a pride of community and neighborhood were things that they have seen through, I don't want to say experiments, but through trials, I guess. They've seen in different parts of the country that helped reduce the culture of violence and the number of gangs, and also improving educational opportunities. State presence in the new neighborhoods improves the possibility for planned urban growth and also reduces the gangs. The more homicides there are, the higher burden there is on the police force, which unfortunately creates a reinforcing loop where the clearance rate goes down and the number of homicides goes up. This is because there's an implied impunity if they can't clear cases. The more homicides there are, the lower the social cohesion. The lower the social cohesion, they felt very strongly, the higher a culture of violence. In other words, social cohesion worked against culture of violence. The more homicides there are, the lower feeling of security. The lower feeling of security, the higher pressure to incarcerate. The more higher drug traffic, the more higher pressure to incarcerate as well. This increases the public prison population, and the higher the prison population, the lower the control there is in the prison, and of course then there's more gangs running the prisons. This leads to more gang members and more gangs. The higher the prison population, the higher resocialization should be lower recidivism, which lowers gang members. The more homicides there are, the less economic activity there is, the less employment or sufficient income for people, and therefore people turn to gangs, so the more gang members there are. The more homicides there are, the less access to basic services, which lowers social cohesion, and more people are exposed to gangs, and we get more gang members. The lower the feeling of security, the higher perhaps the actions of social prevention, or people support the action of social prevention, which causes where we're trying to fix in the community what's causing people to turn to crime. And the more social prevention, the higher social cohesion, and the fewer people are exposed to gangs. Okay, so this is a good thing. One thing they wanted to do was to try to weaken the link between drug traffic and drug users. They could do this through education, for example. Another thing they wanted to do was try to weaken this link as well. They wanted the burden on the police force to not necessarily affect the clearance rate. So they could, for example, adopt new technology, more efficient methods, do more training. They also wanted to weaken this link, that the pressure to incarcerate actually led to more incarceration. Finally, they wanted to break this link, that conflict to gangs led to a culture of violence. They would need to, separate those people who felt they were in gangs from those people who were not in gangs. So with possible interventions in these places, to weaken the link between police burden and clearance rate, I already said they could modernize the police force to improve efficiency. They could develop a qualified repression strategy. That could work. More training, I already said. Oh, this was very important. They felt the police weren't always valued. They didn't always have decent pay, decent work conditions, or even the workload. They were working too much. So they thought you should value them with these conditions, and that would help. Also, if there's better coordination between police and the judicial institutions, that would help. To weaken the link between drug traffic and drug users, they thought social prevention, which didn't actually connect in the CLD, but social prevention around education and outreach campaigns would help. They thought maybe legalizing marijuana would help, because a lot of people are involved in the drug traffic and are just marijuana users, nothing worse than that. To cut the link between the conflict between gangs and the culture of violence, they were thinking, for example, they could help youths at risk by sponsoring things like the Big Brother program in the United States. They could try to strengthen family relationships, which would reduce recruiting, and there are ways to do that. Social workers and educational institutions can help with that. They wanted to have new conflict mediation techniques. Instead of, I'm going to beat you up, or I'm going to knife you, or I'm going to shoot you, how else can we resolve our conflicts in a more peaceful, or I should say a less violent way? And they wanted to teach those in the schools. They wanted to create a mixed civilian military at the middle school and the high school level, feeling that the discipline that having some of the military people learning in the same schools would then rub off some on the other students, and the pride that those people studying to be in the military might also rub off on them. To weaken the link between pressure to incarcerate and the prison population, they needed to reduce the feeling of insecurity they felt, and higher police presence might help with that. There are other things. They can also educate people that if you keep pressuring us to do this and we do this, that it actually makes the situation worse, and try to get people to understand that and reduce that pressure that way. They could also have the media help them. So the media could run articles talking about how this could help if they reduce this pressure and educate the population that way. They could also update the prison information systems, because apparently people end up staying years after they're supposed to leave, and that's a problem also. It makes it harder for them to come back, and they're also subject to more gang activities while they're still in prison. Finally, to strengthen economic activity, they wanted to add technical job training to give people higher incomes. And for social coherence, they wanted to create security councils between citizens and police. This should be of. So create community security councils between citizens and police they could work together and look at the problems they're having now. How can we fix them? How can we address them as a community? In conclusion, I strongly believe that you can reach far more people in government with systems thinking than trying to teach everyone how to model. You can provide them with a common language to talk with each other and discuss their complex problems. They can speak with stakeholders using the same language, and they can possibly come up with lasting solutions and things that are actually possible. Notice when I teach systems thinking, I didn't say this, I should say this, but when I teach it, I start with stocks and flows. I don't want anyone building CLDs without knowing what a stock and flow is, and that you need to mostly have stocks and maybe have some flows in your CLDs. So there are many rules about their CLDs to try to keep them realistic and not being things that don't make sense. So I already mentioned that not everyone will be a modeler. Let's just face it. We're modelers, fine, but not everyone's going to be a modeler. In fact, there'll be fewer modelers than the rest of the world. You want to include stakeholders whenever possible. They're the ones who know what's going on. They're the experts on the ground often, and they also can be very influential. If you don't include them, they can, stop you. They can put up barriers. Having these group model building workshops after teaching a systems thinking class about their specific problem really makes them appreciate the method, really helps them understand how this can help them and how they can use it. And I think it's really critical to split that. Like, I did full day workshops in each problem area, but I split them because people need to adjust to what they've gone through, what they've talked about. They need to think about it some more. They need to evaluate it. They need to sleep on it a bit. They come back with better and different ideas. In the last group that I was there was almost a week between when I met the first group and the first time and when I met them the second time. When I met them the second time, they had a completely different idea already. They'd been thinking about it the whole time. They had a completely different idea about how the system worked than they had earlier. There's nothing here that's simulating. We just have CLDs. We're just talking about structure. We're not talking about anything else. Yet we can still come up with insights. These insights are still possible even with models that are not complete and models that are not simulating. And that's valuable. I look forward to hearing your questions. Thank you very much for the presentation, for allowing me to give this presentation. I appreciate it very much. Have a good day.